A UN disaster scenario, Noam Chomsky and UN warn of collapse of civilization. Noam Chomsky and United Nations warn of the collapse of our civilization, what the caterpillar calls the end of the world, life calls the butterfly. This is according to Lao Tzu, 6th century BC. And this is an article I've translated for you from Leonidas Aposkitis. In last year's excellent apocalyptic satirical comedy, Don't Look Up, we saw the story of two astronomers trying to warn humanity of an approaching comet that will destroy human civilization. And this American film is a satire of governmental, political, and journalistic indifference towards the intensifying crisis and the possible collapse of humanity. The two heretical scientists, quote-unquote, are treated almost like sprayed conspiracy theorists by systemic journalism and the entangled technocracy. It's a Netflix comedy starring Leonardo DiCaprio as an apocalyptic cautionary tale, which is why it has already earned an important place in modern pop culture. The ignorance of the entire political system is highlighted in the most characteristic way through the selfish and money-hungry persona of the President of the United States, played by Meryl Streep, accompanied by Jonah Hill, who plays her snobbish son, who is also White House Chief of Staff. Don't Look Up satirically exaggerates the scientific fact, first denied and then heavily politicized by world leaders who make their decisions ignoring the threat of our own self-destruction and counting only on the short-term gains of the super-rich elite. The film sends a strong SOS message that something is seriously wrong in our society. In just 1 year since the release of the film, in an acute phase of transformation of the world order where the prospects for a precarious future look anything but good, the central idea of the film is verified in a dramatic way after a new report of the UN, published in April, warns that a total societal collapse becoming more and more likely. The Global Assessment Report 2022, GAR 2022, which was published by the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDRR, reveals that in the last 2 decades, 350 to 500 medium and large-scale natural disasters have occurred annually. But this report, entitled Our World at Risk, has attracted little or no interest from the media and the political class in the Western world, verifying the film we mentioned. Not a single media outlet addressed this huge issue, the growing possibility of civilizational collapse. Buried in the report, which was endorsed by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, is the finding that escalating synergies between disasters, economic vulnerabilities, and ecosystem failures are escalating the risk of a global collapse scenario. In the UN office ahead of the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction in May 2022 predicts that the world will face around 560 disasters each year by the year 2030. If current trends continue, the number of disasters per year globally could increase from around 400 in 2015 to 560 per year by 2030, a projected increase of 40%. When it comes to droughts, there's a lot of variation. From year to year, current trends show an increase of more than 30% between 2000 and the year 2030. And the number of the extreme temperature events per year is also increasing, and on current trends will almost triple by the year 2030. Disasters have negative impacts on biodiversity and environmental sustainability, as well as social and economic systems. Average annual direct economic losses from disasters have more than doubled over the past 3 decades. The indirect effects of disasters can have far-reaching knock-on effects on other aspects of structural or social inequality and other social ills, such as violence against women and homicide. Risks are increasing worldwide. There are a number of cost of disasters. As risk multiplies, it has increasing impacts on communities and entire systems. global effects become local and vice versa. The risk of a serious nuclear accident in Ukraine, Zaporizhia, due to the war in Ukraine is very serious, which is why the concern of the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, is obvious. This is the stark conclusion of the report. It is the first time the UN has issued a landmark global report finding that current global policies are accelerating the path to the collapse of human culture. Yet somehow this urgent warning has remained unreported until now. The fact that extreme weather events that have accelerated in recent years and persistent weather changes have haunted the minds of climatologists and troubled even the most hardened skeptics. It's almost certain that the Earth has been warming, at least since 1850. In the last century alone, the temperature has risen by almost 0.6% Celsius on average worldwide. Sea levels have also risen by about 20 centimeters due to ocean warming, which causes water to expand. But these incremental changes are the least worst scenario. The real meteorological nightmare is the abrupt climate change scenario that recent scientific studies are leaning towards. For example, new evidence shows that this happened about 13,000 years ago at the end of the Ice Age. Climatologists became seriously concerned about this possibility after studying various indications of the planet's temperature found in prehistoric ice sheets in Antarctica. This scientific data shows that a series of dramatic changes in the average temperature of the planet occurred in the past with alarming speed, in some cases even within just a few years. What is certain is that it was not the fault of human activity and the factories that started such a collapse in the distant past. The propaganda of the climate crisis promoted today by the globalist hides other geopolitical interests. The myths and traditions of all people, if we accept them as historical fact, are full of descriptions of phenomena of sudden change of the climate. In historical times, we know only the Little Ice Age, which prevailed after 1380 for several centuries. Now, until recently, scientists generally refused to say anything positive on this subject, citing a lack of data. However, everything changed 2 years ago with the megaton meteorological bomb that the US Pentagon dropped on the heads of all of us, experts and non-experts alike, and it shook even the most fanatical skeptics. We're talking about the classified report by expert scientists who warn that the upheaval of the oceanic and atmospheric systems that control climate stability could occur in less than 1 decade. When scientists research into climate change rattled the U.S. Department of Defense, the Pentagon tapped a distinguished researcher, Peter Schwartz, to coordinate an inquiry into the national security implications of such rapid change. He's a mysterious figure in the American establishment who connects art with real life, working sometimes as an assistant to Steven Spielberg in the futuristic film Minority Report, and sometimes as a consultant to the CIA and the Pentagon. Schwartz contacted leading climate scientists and pressed them to talk to him about all the hypothetical scenarios they are usually reluctant to talk about publicly. The result is a classified report, which was ready in 2004, and according to what has been leaked from it, outlines a dramatic but not improbable scenario in which climate change over the next 20 years could result in a global disaster that will cost millions of lives in wars in natural disasters. Every day, the ominous predictions of a possible future global apocalypse with cataclysmic floods, tornadoes, and extreme weather events. Let's remember what's happening recently in California. They've had 12 atmospheric rivers since December. So future global apocalypse with cataclysmic floods, tornadoes, extreme weather events threatening to destroy our civilization are intensifying. However, we must always be suspicious of the use and ultimate expediency of these scenarios because big games are being played around the climate. On the one hand, we have the conflict between the establishment oil cartels, Republicans, and the US, and the new energy and nuclear power multinationals. That is, Democrats, respectively. On the other hand, every phenomenon such as terrorism, climate information that has supranational dimensions is used by the elite of the New World Order for global punishment, quote unquote, and the dissolution of national constitutions by imposing international regulations and restrictions has happened in the last 2 years, aka COVID-19. Now, the angel of death striking at the door, plague of Rome, reproduction. Despite the abundance of books and articles, we do not have a convincing explanation as to why civilizations collapse. It may be a tipping point when worsened stressors exceed society's ability to cope. Studying the evolutionary record is full of sudden mass extinctions of dominant species. These extinctions have been caused in many cases, by sudden changes in climate to which the species were unable to adapt. After the beginning of the Holocene geologic period, about 11,000 years ago, several large-scale abrupt climate changes occurred that are recorded in the paleoclimatic geological record around the world. Other smaller but also sudden widespread changes to drier or wetter conditions have also been noted for many parts of the world during the second half of the Holocene about 5,000 years ago. Although most of our information is based on a time when the Earth was covered in ice sheets, there were at least a few sudden climate changes that occurred when the ice was no more than today, such as the apparent large-scale cold and drought event that happened during the late Holocene around 3,800 years ago. Archaeologists blame abrupt climate change for the collapse of the classic period Maya civilizations. Also, alternating wet and dry periods seems to have played a role in the rise and fall of the coastal and mountain civilizations of Ecuador and Peru. The beginning of agricultural cultivation in the Middle East is certainly very closely related to a sudden rise in temperature that marks the beginning of the Holocene. Collapse can be defined as rapid and sustained loss of population, identity and socioeconomic complexity. Public services collapse and disorder ensues as the government loses control of the state monopoly. Almost all civilizations of the past faced this fate. Some recovered or transformed, such as the Chinese and Egyptians. Others collapsed permanently, such as the case of Easter Island. Sometimes cities at the center of the collapse are revived, as happened with Rome. In other cases, like the Mayan ruins, they remain abandoned as mausoleums for future tourists. Our entire past is characterized by repeated phenomena such as these. As Luke Kemp says, as part of my research at the Center of the Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge, I try to find out why the collapse happens through historical autopsy. What can the rise and fall of historical civilizations tell us about our own? What are the forces that accelerate or delay a collapse? And are we seeing similar patterns today? The great historian Arnold Toynbee, in his monumental work on the study of history, concluded that great civilizations are not murdered but kill themselves. In short, civilizations are usually responsible for their own decline, yet their self-destruction is often assisted. If the fate of previous civilizations can be a roadmap for the future of our own, we will see that the four horsemen of the collapse are war, natural disasters, famine, and pestilence. Historians, anthropologists, and other scientists have proposed various explanations, including climate change, the collapse of the Anasazi of the United States, the pre-Columbian Tiwanaku civilization, the Akkadians, the Maya, the Roman Empire, and many others coincide with abrupt climate changes, usually droughts. And environmentalism. This theory of ecological collapse, which has become the subject of best-selling books, points to excessive deforestation, water pollution, soil degradation, and loss of biodiversity as the catalysts. Inequality and oligarchy, wealth inequality, and political inequality can be central agents of the social decay, as can oligarchy and the concentration of power among leaders. Inequality undermines collective solidarity and political unrest ensues. This not only causes social misery, but hampers a society's ability to respond to ecological, social, and economic problems. The field of scalar dynamic models, how factors such as equality and demographics are correlated with political violence. The external shock. The Aztec Empire, for example, was ended by the Spanish invaders. Sometimes the disasters were combined, as was the case of the introduction of Salmonella bacteria by the Spanish invaders to the Americas. We may now be more technologically advanced, but that does not give us enough reason to believe we're immune to the threats that destroyed our ancestors. Our new technological capabilities also bring new unprecedented challenges into the mix, Luke Kemp emphasizes. In recent years, a growing number of academics in the humanities have turned, perhaps because of the crisis in their own ranks, their attention to even larger crises that threaten America and the world today. Sophia Rosenfeld's book, Democracy and Truth, A Short History, and Roy Scranton's book, We're Doomed, Now What? Essays on War and Climate Change, We're Doomed, Now What? Essays on War and Climate Change, exemplifying the growing trend of scholars willing to learn from their own tower, lean from their own tower, and intervene in critical public debates. In Democracy and Truth, Rosenfeld examines our own moment of post-truth, alternative facts, and the truth is not the truth, and reveals how intense controversies over truth are an integral part of the history of democratic theory and practice. While Rosenfeld shows that there is a long prehistory to the truth wars raging today, Scranton shows that there may not be much of a future for the planet as we know it. Scranton first emerges as a commentator on climate change and war with his striking essay, Learning How to Die in the Anthropocene, in the New York Times in 2013. What does a life mean in the face of a species death or the collapse of global civilization? Scranton thus began a philosophical confrontation about the Anthropocene as a concept and a lived reality. The point is that now we have to learn how to die and live, not as individuals, but as a culture, he says. Both Rosenfeld and Scranton acknowledge that modern capitalism is part of history. Although now the subject is to sustained analysis, Rosenfeld acknowledges that it's time again to think of alternatives to the logic of the market always knows best, and that the history of modern democracy also remains the history of modern capitalism, and any real solution to our current woes requires possibly treating them in combination. No doubt, big business seeks less regulation, and tax burdens has found that populist anger can be turned into lucrative profits, going so far as to show that government interventions may be for the benefit of the independent and liberal elites. The political economist Benjamin Friedman once compared modern Western society to a stationary bicycle whose wheels are spun in the air by economic growth. If we don't find a way to set the bicycle in motion, we will eventually face total social collapse. Such collapses have occurred in many times in human history, and no civilization, however great it may seem, is immune to the vulnerabilities that can lead a society to its end. History tells us that it's usually a multitude of factors that contribute to collapse. The UN scenario? According to a scenario repeated throughout history, disasters come when elites push society towards instability and eventually collapse by amassing vast amounts of wealth and resources and leaving little or nothing for ordinary citizens who far outnumber them but they support them with their work. The inequalities we see today, both within and between countries, are already indicative of such inequalities. As time passes, the Western Empire becomes increasingly insignificant, and Western societies may face a violent, dramatic end and drag the world with it, into it. Things are bad, very bad, writes journalist David Wallace Wells in his book Uninhabited Earth, A History of the Future, who has edited dozens of scientific studies, articles, surveys, and books to collect the data he reports. Through all this volume of data, it's exceptionally stated that blind faith in technology and uncontrollable market forces cuts in infrastructure spending, the non-existence of a welfare state due to one from the oil planting. Now, despite the abundance of books and articles, we do not have a convincing explanation as to why civilizations collapse. It may be a tipping point when worsening stressors exceed society's ability to cope. And great civilizations kill themselves. Studying the collapse of historical civilizations can tell us how much danger we face today, says collapse expert Luke Kemp. It's worrying that the signs are getting worse. The evolutionary record is full of sudden mass extinctions of dominant species. These extinctions have been caused in many cases by sudden changes in climate to which the species were unable to adapt. After the beginning of the Holocene geologic epoch about 11,000 years ago, several large-scale abrupt climate changes occurred that are recorded in the paleoclimatic geological record around the world. Other smaller, sudden, widespread changes to drier or wetter conditions have also been noted for many parts of the world during the second half of the Holocene about 5,000 years ago. Through all this volume of data, it's explicitly stated that blind faith in technology and controllable market forces cuts infrastructure spending. Now, scientists also sending out a strong SOS for the reversal of the Earth's poles, which is likely to happen soon, they say. The temporary collapse of Earth's magnetic field 42,000 years ago caused major climate changes that led to global environmental changes and mass species extinctions, according to a new international study led by UNSW, University of New South Wales, Sydney, and the Museum of South Australia. This dramatic turning point in Earth's history, interspersed with electrical storms, widespread aurora and cosmic radiation, was caused by the reversal of Earth's magnetic poles and changing solar winds. The researchers named this dangerous period the Transient Geomagnetic Adams Event, or Adams Event for short, in homage to the science fiction writer Douglas Adams. For the first time in history, we've been able to precisely date the timing and environmental impact of the last magnetic pole reversal, says Chris Gurney, professor of New South Wales New South Wales School of Science and one of the study lead's authors. It's known that our planet is surrounded by a very strong magnetic field which originates from its core and which protects us from destructive solar storms. Many aspects of our daily lives depend on the Earth's magnetic field, the anchors of which are the North and South poles. Electricity, telecommunications, and even the orientation of many animals depend on it, as Alana Mitchell writes in her book, The Spinning Magnet. However, this was not always the case with the dipole north and south magnetic poles of the Earth because they reverse periodically. In a new report, Daniel Baker, director of atmospheric and space physics at the University of Colorado, claims there are signs of a reversal. As he states, if this reversal occurs, it's likely to render some areas of the planet uninhabitable, he says. And what will be our fate? The consequences are potentially catastrophic, claims Daniel Baker, an expert on solar radiation and how it affects our planet. He says he has no doubt that parts of our planet will become uninhabitable but we cannot predict what they will be. What he means is that extra UV radiation, ultraviolet radiation, which is harmful to human tissue and can cause mutations, will hit the planet because we won't have the magnetic shield to protect us. These tormenting feelings of the experts, who have often been ridiculed by the media as catastrophists, are confirmed by the recent UN report, UN Global Assessment Report, GAR 22, in which in June the well-known thinker Noam Chomsky mentioned one of the most distinguished political cartographers of globalization and its risks. We are at a unique moment in human history, he said. The decisions that must be made right now will determine the course of future history, if there is to be human history, which is very doubtful. There is a narrow margin within which we must implement measures to prevent cataclysmic environmental destruction. On the occasion of the recent UN warning, Noam Chomsky, speaking as a keynote speaker at the 51st Annual Conference of the American Solar Energy Society, University of New Mexico, reiterated the central assumption of the doomsday experts: the challenge before us is beyond anything humans have ever faced. The fate of life on the planet is now at hand, he said. Chomsky questions the survival of humanity with key phrase as follows: if there is to be any human history, which is very doubtful, this statement does not come from some Hollywood thriller screenwriter, but from Noam Chomsky, the best-known figure in U.S. academia. Chomsky expresses the same sentiments as the planet's doomsayers, and coupled with an improbable but real analysis of United Nations doomsayers that is far deeper and more terrifying than has ever been heard publicly about what is coming. According to Chomsky, for most of history, Homo sapiens lived in harmony with nature until August 6, 1945, the day it taught us two hard lessons. One, human capacity reaching the level to destroy everything. And two, very few seem to care. The result, now we are at the point where the major institutions of organized society are intent on destroying organized human life on Earth and the millions of other species, and very few seem to care enough to stop it. Indeed, we're talking about the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. Now, the fate of the world hangs on what happens in Washington. It's not a secret. Indeed, New York Times energy environment correspondent Coral Davenport described in a recent New York op-ed a long, carefully executed campaign to destroy organized human life on Earth. Republican drive to tilt courts against climate action. Chomsky acknowledges that the Times article may seem outrageous, but he believes it's completely accurate. As explained in it, the campaign has been meticulously carried out for years by Energy System. It is enormous in institutional scope, including fossil fuel companies, banks, and other financial institutions, and much of the legal community. It also has an international support base called NATO. In addition to the primary concerns about a growing threat of nuclear war and the failure to prevent deadly global warming, a new concern has been added: the degradation of rationality. I shouldn't laugh. If he cannot close this gap, there is no hope of closing the terror in time to save us. Moreover, for Chomsky, there is a deeper question. This is the famous Fermi paradox, having to do with extraterrestrials and where is everybody. Enrico Fermi, 1901 to 1954, was a distinguished astrophysicist, a Nobel Prize winner in physics in 1938, and felt certain of the reality of a huge number of planets with conditions that could sustain life and lead to superior intelligence. And according to Chomsky, one answer that has been proposed and cannot be rejected is that higher intelligence has indeed been developed by many times over the centuries, but has always proven fatal. However, the situation is likely to be worse than acknowledged in the UN report. Britain's Byline Times revealed last summer, according to Professor Will Steffen of the Stockholm Research Centre, two more planetary limits ocean acidification, the lowering of pH value of seawater, and the use of fresh water, probably within the decade, they will also have been crossed, which means we are violating 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries. If we continue to push the limits at this rate, we're likely to push through almost all of them before the year 2030. The planetary boundaries framework was developed by the Stockholm Resilience Center in 2009 to provide what it calls a science-based analysis of the risk that human perturbations will destabilize the Earth system on a planetary scale. This framework identifies a series of 9 key ecosystems which, if they cross a certain threshold, will dramatically reduce the safe operating space for human population. The UN report notes that at least 4 of the 9 planetary boundaries now appear to be operating outside the safe operating space. Nafez Ahmed, British investigative journalist and former visiting researcher at Anglia Ruskin University School of Science, in an article in Democracy Press makes this comment. But there are reasons to suspect that a collapse process has already begun, even if it can still be contained. A senior advisor to UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction and contributor to GAR 2022, the Global Assessment Report, who spoke to Byline Times on condition of anonymity, claims that the world had passed the point of no return. He said, "And I don't feel that this has been correctly perceived by the United Nations or in the media." In UN GAR 2022, however, is a landmark document. It's the first time that the United Nations has clearly highlighted the imminent risk of a total societal collapse, quote unquote, if the human system continues to exceed the planetary boundaries critical to maintain a safe operating space for the Earth system. And the document reports, the political global instability will be exacerbated by a rapidly deteriorating environment, which could lead to further conflict and impede future progress towards global goals. Therefore, the world is on a path towards a global collapse scenario, and only very ambitious and humanitarian policies, if adopted, can stop the current carousel of destruction. The famous doomsday clock at the University of Chicago is a metaphor for the threats to humanity from uncontrolled technological and political developments. In 2020, it moved to 2 minutes before midnight for the first time since 1953, and now after the war in Ukraine, it's at 100 seconds. When it resets, Chomsky fears it may move the 1 minute hand even closer to midnight, which is the final hour at which humanity destroys itself either by banging or suffocating. This is published in Third Eye, September 2022. I've translated this for you from a Greek article. Please leave your comments, and thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support, and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box